closer to China in 2016 are still a lot closer to China in 2021 in your own methods. But I don't think that's right. For example, like Singapore is a country you identify as a country a lot closer to China, to the US and also the Philippines. So based on this, I kind of think that probably, those have military bases, US military bases, country having military bases, probably in your own interpretation, that's the countries that move closer to the US. But if that's the case, what about Thailand? Right? Thailand used to have a big military bases, although a lot of US military just withdraw, but there's still some small bases there. And Thailand probably in the strategic context should be considered as moving closer to US, rather than the neutral. It's okay if you think Thailand is neutral, but you have to provide the way you measure it, so I can have a more objective judgment based on your own methods to see whether it makes sense or not. Or if you don't have that kind of criteria, I can have a lot of my own interpretations, why. For another example is Philippines, right? Philippines, even if you measure the former president, Rodrigo Duterte, sometimes it seems to move closer to China, and sometimes seems to go farther away from China. So how do you capture these fluid situations if you use a fixed geopolitical positioning as you use in your research? So that's the main problem I see in the independent variable. And the fourth question is about probably your own analysis. You find that geopolitical factors are not ideal to explain, the participation in these banks by the Southeast Asian countries. And I totally agree with you. That's it's pretty similar to my own research. So I would suggest that if you're trying to use strategic or geopolitical factor as the independent variable, probably the dependent variable should not be the AIB or ADB. The BRI is a much more suitable things for you to study. And I think the contemporary studies on BRI all shows that there's a very clear geopolitical manipulations for China in promoting the BRI. But AIB actually, the most studies I saw, even though there's a lot of speculation, there's a lot of arguments, but empirical studies does not suggest that AIB have a very thick, very strong geopolitical implications there. So I would suggest that probably BRI is your next focus if you want to link the geopolitical factors to the state's behavior in China's grand economic spacecraft around the world. So that's pretty much my first round comment. Probably we can have next round, a second round exchange after Ari's and finish his presentation and the discussions. Okay, so I'll stop here. Thanks very much. So let's invite our second presenter, Ari Blackney, to present his paper titled Quantifying Aggressive Discourse in International Conflict, the South China Case.
I don't know if this is going to work because I downloaded it as a PDF, so...
Okay, you
guys,
right?
Cool.
Okay.
By the way, do you guys mind if I stand? Just
sure,
like
no.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, my co-author couldn't be here. So the title of the paper, Quantifying Aggressive Discourse, was the original intent, and this is kind of a work in progress, and it's trying to test some new methods here. It's a little bit less traditional than the last paper, but I'll try to explain why I think it's useful. So some of the major findings here were that using machine learning to discover some of the latent patterns or words that were used prior to conflicts might help to elucidate some of the unclear red lines of countries. So in terms of these gray zone conflicts, like in the South China Sea, where we don't know exactly what sparks sometimes these little conflicts, maybe using machine learning can uncover something that's not evident just looking at it from the surface, because we can use machine learning to look at a much bigger set of data, much larger corpus. The second major finding is that the predictive models were pretty accurate. So in terms of coding them and using machine learning to try to predict based on the words in a statement whether a conflict would occur, when it was tested, it was pretty accurate, but there is definitely some room for improvement. And it also shows that there are some elements, some textual elements, some words that might be predictive of either conflict or calm. And then some of the keyword analysis showed that there were some of the associated keywords or themes here might be useful, providing some analytic tools to help better understand some of these gray zone conflicts where they're a little bit less opaque. Okay. Let's see, so this was basically using machine learning to do discourse analysis, which is, it's pretty common to understand state stances, especially looking at like foreign policy language, but I haven't seen that much usage of machine learning to process the data. But the reason that machine learning is useful is because it can process much larger quantities of data, and it can also kind of uncover latent patterns that are not visible to human coders who might miss something. So it uses the South China Sea as a test case because unlike a lot of international incidents, this one has a lot of individual sub-incidents. So we were able to temporally link them to statements issued by the respective foreign ministries. In this one, we used the three countries with the largest number of incidents in the South China Sea, which were the PRC, the Philippines, and Vietnam. So yeah, we scraped all of the official statements, and then I manually coded each statement in terms of the temporal proximity. So if it occurred within 30 days prior to a conflict, if it occurred after 30 days, or if it was unrelated to an existing conflict. So if the text happened within 30 days, but it was unrelated to the conflict, for instance, like if there was a conflict in the South China Sea, but they made a statement about like whatever, some third country, it wasn't coded as related to the conflict. Okay. So again, the reason machine learning is useful here is it can process a much larger corpus of data, and it can find word associations that might not appear to the naked eye. So things, references to places or specific words being used that we might miss. Machine learning can kind of find patterns that are difficult for us to see here. So there's some research that did similar things, but what this attempts to do is build on the previous research by providing advancements somewhat in the methods here and providing some stop word filtering, some comparison of different machine learning methods, and then it adds an analytic element where it's not only testing whether you can predict a conflict, it's also testing, or it's also looking at what keywords and what themes were associated with the lead up to a conflict breaking out in the South China Sea, or the term I use here is the Southwest Pacific because I feel like it's less politically loaded. So the reason this is also a very good test case is because a lot of the problems that happen with machine learning and text analysis happen because of nuance, because it can't process things like sarcasm or humor. But when you have official statements from governments issued in this way, they're all issued with English translations, and the style is basically identical, and they're all direct. The meaning has to be direct. So there's very little nuance lost, as you sometimes find with other kinds of discourse or text analysis, especially with computers, because computers can't detect irony, right? So the research design here was basically first using Python to script the ministerial websites for these three countries. Again, the countries with the largest number of military, well, let's say armed incidents in the South China Sea region here. Then the data was homogenized and the stop words removed, the data was tokenized, but also, I forgot to put it here, but each statement was manually coded for either predictive of a conflict, meaning it happened within 30 days prior to the conflict, during a conflict, if some of the conflicts were protracted for several days in between, or if it occurred after a conflict, or if it was just neutral. And then there were several models run here, and I'll show you the comparison later, but that's not the most important part. I think something that's more analytically useful was the keyword analysis, which was performed after, based on this. So after it was determined that the computer is able to find patterns that link some of the usages of words with conflicts, the conflict-related words were then, we used machine learning to perform keyword analysis and find the major themes and some of the keywords that were most closely associated with conflicts breaking out here. And then we tried some new stuff, which I haven't seen used in other papers, which is using PCA on text data to try to map the discourse space between countries and between the use of the text in terms of predicting a conflict or during a conflict here. And then finally, factor analysis was performed to find just another method here to find which keywords might have been linked to these latent patterns here. I had some links here, but that's okay here. So the results for the machine learning in terms of the predictive model were relatively good. I think they were upwards of 90% able to predict. So basically, what we did is we fed it statements. There's a training set and then a testing set. So we fed it a training set and we coded each statement as whether it was predictive of a conflict or occurred during a conflict or after a conflict. And then after training the machine learning model, it was using a test set afterwards. It was able to predict accurately something like, I think 93% of the time for some of the better models. So it shows that there are definitely some keywords and some textual essences there that the computer can definitely use to predict it here. And then the structural topic modeling later, the keyword analysis, helped to parse out the words. Well, basically what it does is it finds the words that offer the highest variance between the statements, but it also, particularly when used for pre-conflict data, it gave a set of important topics and keywords that occurred specifically prior to conflicts there. So this is just showing you here. This is just one of the models, but the second model, after training, yeah, the testing was 93% accurate. So this is pretty good for a set that I think included something like 1,300 statements or something like that. So it was a pretty large set. And then this is the second model here. So this is trying to predict. Here, this is just a matrix of the test set here. So these are the predicted and these are the actual. So you can see this is one of the problems, is that most of the statements that were issued were not related to conflicts here, the ones that were scanned here. So most of them were predicted to have no relation to the conflict, and actually they had no relation. So of course that probably inflates the accuracy figure a lot. In terms of predicting actual conflict and being right about the conflict, it was a little more hit and miss. And you can see there are some false negatives here, which is alarming. So it obviously can't be used to predict a conflict, but it shows that there are some keywords that still help the computer to be able to do this far better than at random or far better than average. So there are some useful elements in the text worth looking at here. So for the structural topic modeling, the topic analysis, it basically picked 5 theme groups here of words that were likely to show up prior to a conflict. So the first theme was centered around territorial disputes. So it included words like sovereignty, peace, stability, those kinds of things. And the way I interpreted it, and the rest of the keywords, was about delineating the boundaries for action in the region, showing countries like which areas were theirs and how to maintain stability. The second one was about legalism, so it was probably complaints about people's disrespect for like the tribunal. So this was in particular for the Philippines, the tribunal ruling about their maritime claims there. So it included words like navigation, law, legal interests, things like that. The third one was about freedom of navigation. You can see really clearly freedom, navigation, flight, passage, those kinds of things. The fourth one regarded norms. So it included words like conduct, guiding, basic principles, maintenance, and respect. And the fifth one was specifically about incidents. So this one's probably, yeah, making references to what might happen in the future, talking about certain regions where things are taking place. So East, and this, the word that it picked out was East, but I assume it's a reference to the East Sea, which is what Vietnam often labels the South China Sea. Parallel islands, which are referred to the Vietnamese as the Wenzao archipelago. So this was also a key word here. Fishing boat, which is often the source of a lot of these conflicts, and escalate. This is just what the topic modeling looks like and how it was constructed here. I don't know how useful this is for you guys, but this later was the mapping that we constructed based on this. So basically this vector shows, so each of these points represents a single statement issued by one of the respective foreign ministries, and they're color-coded here. So the usefulness of this is it actually can represent how the countries differ and how each article differs in a kind of 2D space. And the axes here are not clear on the surface, but what these are essentially is principal components, which is they're making up a composite of different elements of keywords specifically. And you can actually break these down to see what these are if you're interested. But based on those 5 topics I showed you before, these vectors each represent a direction for the topic to show how close a statement is to each of those topics, or how close it is to an active conflict, or the lead up to a conflict, showing some hostility before a conflict breaks out. So again, I haven't seen this being done for text, especially in social sciences. So I think it's useful, and it helps you understand some of these analytical elements and how they're used by different countries too. Because you can see, for instance, just one thing to note here: China often issues statements after an incident breaks out, whereas Vietnam often issues a statement before they break out. So you can see some of the temporal change. Vietnam is much more concentrated towards the right-hand side, and China, the bulk of it is towards the left-hand side for active conflicts. So you can use this kind of map to kind of parse out some of those elements here. The factor analysis, this is kind of a duplication, but it's just using another method here to trying to determine which themes are most relevant in pre-conflict data here. So it picks out factors by itself. So the first one was about geographic terms and naval incidents. So it includes words like Navy live fire illegally Venom Reef Luzon in the Philippines. So these are clearly predictive of some kind of incident around the Philippines here. This one was about, the second factor was setting goals, and included the keywords here were peace, stability, and law. And then the final factor was associated with Vietnamese, specifically Vietnamese data. So like a lot of the words were associated with Vietnamese claims here. So Spratly EC, Truong Archipelago, and then the word sovereignty here. So it's a lot of data, but rather than just approaching it as a massive data, I think the way to look at this is to try to kind of separate these by country and separate these by theme, to see which areas are the most consequential and see how different countries represent their interests and represent their goals leading up to these conflicts, to try to understand what's going on, what their red lines are. So of all, the clearest terms and hotspots linked to a conflict breaking out were these words: freedom of navigation, Spratly Islands, and escalate. So these were the three key words at least. The high degree of accuracy of the models indicates that there are specific words and phrases associated with pre-conflict statements, and that machine learning is useful for this. But I just want to be frank, there are a lot of limitations to this. One of them is what I mentioned, that, for instance, Vietnam is much more likely to issue statements before, and China is much more likely to issue them after, which means that in the model construction, it's probably biasing the pre-conflict models, considering that the majority of them came from Vietnam. So their different usage of the terms will probably throw off the model a little bit. Yeah, the difference also, some countries don't make statements at all prior to clashes and some after. But so maybe in the future, introducing a scale, like a scale to rank the seriousness of the clashes might help, but it's very difficult because of the opacity. A lot of these conflicts take place in the open sea, and there's no way to actually measure how many people die or the seriousness, stuff like that. Yeah, the predictive models need further refinement to give an indication of the degree of accuracy. And then the last limitation is disproportionate balance between neutral pre-conflict and conflict data. So most of the statements issued did not relate to a conflict. So it means that because the way this is constructed splits the entire data set into training and testing models, and it's totally randomized. If the training model doesn't include enough conflict data, it could be totally irrepresentative, and it could give a bad model. So there are some issues with the model construction here that could be improved. So just to reiterate, I think that this represents a really powerful tool to uncover some of the latent relationships, especially with big quantities of data, like 1,000 something statements. They're really hard to parse by hand, right? And some of these keywords, you wouldn't notice them if you're reading 1,000 statements. So it can help find some of these patterns that we wouldn't be able to find with the naked eye here. So any future revisions here will include some of these tools that weren't included in the draft of the paper that I already submitted. The PCA I added later here. And again, this is one of the first cases I've seen of PCA being used on textual data. So I think, yeah, this method might be useful for especially mapping discourse spaces in relation to international relations in terms of yeah, statements issued by foreign ministries and things like that. So hopefully this is useful. And I think it's also especially useful in gray zones where governments are often opaque about the causes and borders of these conflicts. It can help discover things that are not so open, not nuanced, but maybe not so clear. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Ariel, for the very interesting research using a very sophisticated method. So let's invite Dr. Padriati for your comments on Ariel's paper. Thank you.
Just next. Okay. Yeah, after the sorry. After reading through your paper, I make some comments. You make some good point actually, especially if your purpose is how to quantify it. You did it.
That was the original intent.
Yeah. For example, you're measuring the degree of aggressiveness related to the potential for conflict, the aggressive score, and then you also identifying discursive differences between the participants involved. And model may be useful to predict outbreak of violence. And dealing with the case, it's good. Your focus in South China Sea. The case is hitting up and just in time for review. And your findings, I think it's worth it for a researcher and want to continue the interpretations. However, the next please. Question. The final state of every data or pattern is interpretation actually. So this is what I look for. Probably I would suggest that I refer to the discourse analysis. That's the purpose of discourse analysis is to unveil the motivation behind discourse. So if your focus is on quantifying aggressive discourse, probably it would be benefit or it would be good if you add some analysis of your finding. For example, why did China issue post facto statement, for example, more aggressive, more active, while Vietnam took the opposite side, the opposite stand, for example. So I think you have many data. Probably you can put some analysis further. I think that's interesting. Okay. And finally, I just quote in the post-truth and alternative fact era, information and constructive discourses matter as they are not merely assets but also weapons. For example, this is just bluffing or just want to make such kind of warning, representing and to make a warning that this is I'm serious. For example, I think you have a lot of data about this. I just make illustration that secession and referendum have become the accepted narrative of the world. Since 1919, there have been many referendums such as Macedonia, Eritrea, Quebec, and Scotland. So I just want to show that discourse is important, but it's need further analysis. Thank you.
Okay, so let's welcome some questions or comments from the floor first, and then probably our presenters can respond to the comments from discussants in the floor. Okay, please.
Thank you. My name is Aziz. I'm a PhD student at NCKU. I have questions for both presenters. For the first presenter, I'm wondering, why do you single out AIIB and ADB in this case? Because especially I heard that your analysis is connected with the behavior of the state. For example, I'm from Indonesia, and in Indonesia, some institutions in Indonesia got funding from Islamic Development Bank, IDB. So in this case, what are your considerations in such a way that you only select AIIB and ADB? not including IDB, Islamic Development Bank. And then for the second presenter, okay, my research is also belongs to discourse research. The design is a discourse analysis. As far as I'm concerned, you mentioned keyword analysis, right? Okay. One of the drawbacks of keyword analysis is when the original statement is not in English. I saw your slide that your keywords are in English, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, I'm asking this because you see like 3 countries that are not English-speaking countries: China, Vietnam, and Philippines. What about if the original statement is not aggressive? For example, in Mandarin Chinese language, certain statements might not be considered aggressive, but in the English translation, it turns out to be aggressive. So how do you deal with this kind of situation? Thank you.
Thank you. So do we have any other comments or questions from the floor? Okay, so let's invite our presenters to answer the first round of the questions and comments.
Thank you for the question. I chose these 2 MDBs because I'm mainly focusing on the competition between China and the US. And these 2 regional MDBs, one is led by the US and Japan, the other one is led by China, so I found them to be more comparable, if that makes sense.
Do you want to reply to my comments?
Oh yeah,
Also?
Sure, I thought it's good. Okay. Thank you, Professor Chen, for constructive suggestions. So on the first question, it is definitely the case that it is very hard for the voting structure, voting power allocation to change in any significant way. And the original purpose for tracking and comparing them, I guess, is because I wanted to see what changes after the AIB enters the picture in 2016. And it turns out the voting power was diluted in the AIB as the members continue to increase. However, I do agree that these 2 institutions should not be framed as competitors, as they also have some joint projects and there's an element of cooperation. So I think that should be addressed. And I think that I also agree that the fluidity of the relationship is not addressed enough, and as well as the standard that tracks the relationship. So I would definitely work on that. And thank you very much for pointing that out.
Thank you. So, Ari, you want to respond?
Sure. Or that way. First, thank you very much for your comments. I agree with basically everything you said. It's very light on interpretation because, yeah, it's kind of a work in progress and working with some new methods, so it's a little bit data focused, but I agree it needs some interpretation. And I also really wonder why there's that gap between China and Vietnam, where Vietnam always speaks before a conflict and China tends to speak after a conflict. So yeah, maybe uncovering that would be interesting. I also think maybe it would be helpful maybe if I could split it up between countries and compare them and see maybe how they address that differently. So thank you very much again.
Yeah, very well.
And then to answer your question, most of the keywords here that it identified as aggressive or like pre-conflict, it wasn't about the words themselves being aggressive, it was just that they were associated with. So a lot of them were just words referring to specific places or like concepts, words like freedom of navigation or different archipelagos, things like that. I totally agree there might be differences in the translation, but that's one of the reasons that I think this data set was useful, is because it was in a uniform language and they have a uniform style, that there's not so much nuance. But yeah, a lot of them aren't directly aggressive in that they're talking about like war. A lot of them, the way that they're framed, talk more about peace and stability than about upcoming conflict. But I'll definitely consider that, and I think maybe a useful thing would be to compare the statements side by side in their languages to see how accurate maybe not how accurate the translation is, but whether they have a different kind of tone or mood to them. Yeah, but